Welcome to Reflections on 500 Years of Navigation and Anti-Conquest, the keynote panel for the Mactan 500 virtual conference. My name is Jordana Mendelson. I'm the director of the KJCC and co-chair of SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative at NYU, a 3-year initiative housed in NYU's Division of the Humanities under the leadership of Dean Carolyn Dinshaw, hosted by the KJCC and generously funded through the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs and House Representative Lauren Lagarda. Throughout the roundtable, please put your comments and questions in the comments section to the right of the Facebook live screen. If you are not logged onto Facebook, you may also send questions to mactan500conference@gmail.com. We will post this email address in the chat along with links to the Mactan 500 conference, which continues tomorrow, and to the SULO website, which lists upcoming activities and events, including the premiere of the online theatrical production of Luis Francia's Black Henry this Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To introduce the panelists of the round table, it is my pleasure to introduce SULO coordinator and member of the Global Philippine Studies Forum, Matthew Nicdao, who is a PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at NYU, about to defend his thesis on aesthetics and politics in the late Spanish Empire, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Matthew's energy, enthusiasm, and expertise have been key to this inaugural year of SULO and the Global Philippine Studies Forum. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to congratulate him, all the members of the forum, and to the panelists and conference participants today for the conference, which has really been an amazing experience to watch. So I'd like to now hand the program over to Matthew Nicdao, who will talk about the panel and the panelists today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Jordana. Welcome again, everyone, to the keynote panel for the Mactan 500 virtual conference organized by the Global Philippine Studies Forum. It's a research collective of graduate students here at NYU, which includes Erica Field in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Michael Salgarolo in the Department of History, and Emily Tumali in the Program of Sociology and Education. This conference is a collaboration with the Bulosan Center for Filipino Studies and ALON, the Journal for Filipinx, American and Diasporic Studies, of course, with generous support from SULO, NYU's History Department, the NYU Portuguese and Spanish Students Association, and the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center at NYU. We want to give a special shout out and thank you to Nick Garcia, Wayne Japanda, and Joseph Ruanto Ramirez for helping us organize this conference. The success of Mactan 500 would not be possible without the participation of the conference panelists, of course, who have graciously shared their brilliant scholarship with us. So thank you to all of our conference participants. The conference does continue tomorrow, so I do hope you join us to attend our last 2 panels. The first, Cultural Production and Colonial Legacies, begins at 10 a.m. and Deconstructing Filipinx American Identities at 1 p.m. And we also want to thank the SULO Steering Committee for the professional, moral, and financial support of the Global Philippine Studies Forum in promoting interest in scholarship in Philippine and Filipinx studies at NYU and the wider New York City metropolitan area, and for giving us the opportunity to engage and build a community with students and scholars working in these fields. And while this is Global Philippine Studies Forum's last event for the academic year, we are planning ahead for next year, so please follow us on social media, check out our WordPress site, or subscribe to our newsletter for updates on upcoming events. I believe there should be a link to our WordPress site in the comment box. So we will begin our panel, Reflections on 500 Years of Navigation and Anti-Conquest, with individual presentations with 3 leaders in the fields of Philippine studies, Doctors John D. Blanco, Una Paredes, and Vicente L. Rafael. Following their presentations, our moderator, Dr. Theodore Gonzalves, will engage the panelists in a roundtable discussion, and then we will open the floor to questions from our audience in a Q&A session. Toward that end, we ask the audience members to please again utilize the Facebook chat to insert their questions, or alternatively, if you're not a Facebook member, you can email your questions to us at mactan500conference@gmail.com. So our first panelist, Dr. John D. or Jody Blanco, is currently an associate professor at UC San Diego, where he teaches modern Philippine Latin American and Asian American literatures, with a focus on the literatures and cultures of early modern globalization under the Spanish Empire. He is the author of Frontier Constitutions, Christianity and Colonial Empire in the 19th Century Philippines, published by University of California Press in 2009, and the translator of Julio Ramos's classic 1989, Desencuentros de la Modernidad in America Latina, under the title Divergent Modernities of Latin America, Culture and Politics in the 19th Century, which was published by Duke University Press in 2001. His current research and book manuscript engages in a comparative study of missionary and indigenous collaboration and conflict in the spiritual conquest of the Philippines between the 16th and 18th centuries. The title of his presentation for this evening is A God is Weeping, Reinterpreting the Conquest. Our second panelist, Dr. Una Paredes, is currently Assistant Professor of Southeast Asian Studies in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. An anthropologist and ethnohistorian by training, her work focuses on the indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia, with a special focus on Mindanao. Her monograph, A Mountain of Difference, The Lumad in Early Colonial Mindanao, was published by Southeast Asia Program and imprint of Cornell University Press in 2013. The monograph portrays the pericolonial encounter between Iberian Catholic missionaries and the ancestors of today's diverse Lumad peoples in the southern Philippines. The title of Dr. Paredes' presentation this evening is Death on the Beach, Decolonizing Mactan's Pericolonial Moment. Our final panelist is Dr. Vicente Rafael, Professor of History at the University of Washington in Seattle. He is the author of several works on the historical and cultural politics of the colonial and post-colonial Philippines. These works include Contracting Colonialism, Translation and Christian Conversion in Tagalog Society under Early Spanish Rule, White Love and Other Events in Filipino History, The Promise of the Foreign, Nationalism, and the Techniques of Translation in the Spanish Philippines, and Motherless Tongues, the Insurgency of Language Amid Wars of Translation. In addition to several edited volumes, he is co-editing a forthcoming special issue of American Quarterly on the politics of language, translation, and multilingualism in American Studies with NYU's own Professor Emerita, Mary Louise Pratt. He's currently completing a book on the politics and aesthetics of the Duterte regime, The Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte, which will be published by Duke University Press in January 2022. The title of his presentation is Duterte's Phallus on the Aesthetics of Authoritarian Vulgarity. And lastly, our moderator, Dr. Theodore S. Gonzalves, is a scholar of comparative cultural studies with specialties in Filipino-American studies and the performing arts. Dr. Gonzalves is a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History and is currently serving as the acting director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. His published works include The Day the Dancers Stayed, Performing in the Filipino/American Diaspora, Filipinos in Hawaii with Roderick and Labrador, and Carlos Villa and the Integrity of Spaces. He is a member of the founding editorial board of ALON, Journal for Filipinx American and Diasporic Studies. And this fall, Dr. Gonzalves, along with co-editor Alan S. Manalo, will release Gossip, Sex, and the End of the World, Collected Works by a Tongue in a Mood, a compilation of scripts, artwork, and music to be published by Archipelago Books. So welcome to the panelists, welcome to our audience, and thank you. And without further ado, I open the floor to our panelists.
Thank you, Jordana and Matthew. Let's get started with Professor Jody Blanco.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you, everybody. I should begin by expressing my gratitude to the organizers of the conference, the director and associate director of the King Juan Carlos Center. And that is Jordana Mendelson, Laura Torregano, and NYU for putting on this event and for inviting me and others to participate in it. Thanks, of course, to Matthew Nickdow, Erica Field, Michael Salgarolo, and Emily Tumale from the Global Philippine Studies Forum and the Philippine Studies Initiative. at NYU. Special thanks to Isabelle Duverger from Tech. It's an honor to be sharing the space with Professors Vicente, Rafael, Una Paredes, and Theo Gonzalves. And so thank you for having us. This presentation I'm going to give is a kind of an excerpt of a longer work that Matthew mentioned earlier, tentatively titled Staging the Scene of Spiritual Conquest, which looks at a selective corpus of missionary writings as a form of literature whose task it was to imagine, reinforce the imagination of a colonial Christian society or commonwealth in the Philippines under the administration of the friar and Jesuit orders. And so I go through a close reading of this literature and its projection or presentation of a kind of imaginary matrix, which tries to, through these readings, to think about and to begin writing a critical history and genealogy of native resettlement, the residence and mission pueblos, and religious conversion by focusing on the anomalous character of the mission as a frontier and frontier-making institution. And so at the heart of it really lies a kind of an ongoing attempt to change the narrative of Hispanization in the Philippines to include and to think about the trajectory of counter-Hispanization that not only it was not only promoted by native leaders, but also the members of the religious orders themselves. And I sort of build on some of the understudied historical treatises of Philippine national martyr Jose Rizal, as well as others, to look at sort of how that counter-Hispanization plays out in both the peculiar legal structure of the mission as a frontier institution, as well as the preservation of certain native institutions throughout the colonial period up to the Philippine 1896 revolution against Spain. Okay, so this title of this is called God is Weeping, and it begins with a kind of reflection on the theme of the conference, the centennial aspect of it. Centennials and commemorations often fill me with a sense of melancholy. They inspire us to imagine and reimagine the beginning of things in the minds of people who could not know with absolute certainty how things would end up. The centennial of Magellan's circumnavigation, in particular, invites us to see ourselves sailing into a world whose contours and oceans had not even been drawn. And you should see a slide of map that was done by Diego Rivera in around 1521 when Magellan was circumnavigating the globe, and you can see really how much of the world had not even been sketched, particularly the New World at that time. But I ask myself, what is the point of this whole exercise of hope? Don't we already know how the story ends? World history, after all, tells us. Despite Magellan's death in Mactan at the hands of Chief Lapulapu, the circumnavigation of the world did happen. The conquest and colonization of the Americas and the Philippines followed, which led to the depopulation of the Philippines by around 36%. Professor Kali Fajardo was talking a little bit earlier about this a comparison and contrast of depopulation in Latin America and the Philippines. While the Philippines certainly didn't experience anything like the death toll in Latin America, depopulation, it certainly did experience a significant depopulation in the first century of colonial rule. At the beginning of the 19th century, an age of political revolution sought to radically change our relationship to tradition, custom, and law. Many failed, including the one that took place in the Philippines in 1896. The succeeding US takeover extended US economic and military supremacy across the Pacific and served as the beachhead for the Pacific theater of World War II and the ensuing Cold War against the Soviet powers. Isn't all that enough, I wonder, to make you sad? Now, I know this may sound like cold comfort, but one consolation I take from the misery and injustice of this narrative is that I'm not alone in feeling sad. People, even entire populations all over the world, were also sad when they saw what depths of depravity and inhumanity these white-skinned barbarians were capable of. They lamented the mutilation of their poets and historians, the incarceration of their healers and soothsayers, the desecration and destruction of their places of spirit veneration, the rape of their 10-year-old children. For those of you who believe I am exaggerating, ask me about it during the discussion, and I'll give you some specific historical examples. I will dedicate this paper to those who wept, the natives whose traditions became twisted beyond recognition, the shamans who were impaled on stakes at the mouth of rivers, and even the gods whose infernal cries carried the names across generations as an irreducible remainder of what was and could no longer be. My argument is that while these lamentations and their stories cannot right the wrongs that we consider to be a necessary sacrifice in this progression of time, they interrupt that historical progression with the phrase, "that happened." And that happening, in the briefest of intervals, draws our attention away from our obsession with beginnings and into the minutiae of the middle. It is this aftermath or afterlife of the beginning where a laboratory of retellings and reinventions of the overarching narrative take place, where the existence of one narrative seeds to the multiplicity and proliferation of others. I begin with the following example. In Father Pedro Quirino's 1604 History of the Philippine Province, the Society of Jesus, a chronicle of the Jesuit province during the last 2 decades of the 16th century, the author records a story or legend reportedly told by the natives of Bohol to each other and eventually to Quirino himself. This story, told by a native informant, recalled how just prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, a female shaman or witch, bailana or bailan, babailan, as they are called in the Visayan region, Catalonia, and among the Tagalogs of Luzon. How this female shaman went about singing, this is in quotes, singing among them in a flood of tears, an unmistakable dirge about the impending catastrophes of the Spaniards that the Spaniards would visit upon the native Boholanos. She was called Cariapa, Quirino writes, and she chanted this. And I won't read the slide, but you can see the slide here that in which Quirino captured both the Boholano poem that was memorized by Cariapa and the various translations of it, both into Spanish and English. Quirino continues, shocked at such a strange song, the whole community berated the bailana with insults and anger. But melting into tears, he continues, she continued despite everything, and when pressured, she replied that the spirit, Diwata, was forcing her to state it. Without a doubt, it was the devil, like the one who sent a note to Moctezuma of Mexico. 2 observations immediately strike the reader here. First, from the time of the reported events to the time that Father Quirino began writing his history of the Jesuit province, almost a half century had passed. Plenty of time for a story to change. Given that the conquistador López de Legazpi signed the first treaty of Boholano native leader or datu Sikatuna in 1565, and given that Cariapa was said to have sung the song before the Spanish arrival, we can surmise that by the time Father Quirino would speak to his interviewee, the Indian informant must have been well advanced in age. One can only speculate, of course, how much of the story actually happened, how much had grown or changed in the intervening decades that had passed, and how much belonged to Father Quirino's own imagination. The missionary chronicles of the religious orders, after all, abound in accounts of apparitions, miracles, ghosts, demons, and spirit possessions, in which it is difficult to disentangle the imagination of the natives from that of the friars and the Jesuits themselves. If we inquire into the possible stakes behind the promotion of such a story, one might suspect that Father Quirino may have either elaborated or even gone so far as to invent it all in order to reach his confident conclusion, to reiterate, quote, without a doubt, it was the devil, like the one who sent a note to Moctezuma, end quote. In saying this, Quirino inserts a proposition that assumes the veracity of Cariapa's prophecy while simultaneously displacing and transposing it to a larger narrative. Quirino's Catholic brand of Western rationality encodes and reframes the presence of the diwata, or spirit, as part of a universal history, an overarching narrative concerning the salvation or condemnation of the human race, tying disparate peoples and cultures across the Pacific Ocean to the devil as a causal principle behind religious evangelization. In the longer work from which this is taken, I've discussed some scholarship around the importance of the devil in the early modern period and the New World. Yet this suspicion raises more questions than it answers. If Babaylan were accorded a respect and veneration for their ability to communicate with spirits, placate the invisible forces that bore down upon an individual or community, and heal the sick, why didn't the community believe her? And in the face of the community's disavowal and censure of the prophecy, why did she insist on its veracity? This first observation on Father Quirino's stake in Cariapa's prophecy leads to the second. For the haste of Quirino's explanation here unwittingly draws our attention to another implied dialogue that seems to be taking place among the natives, not with the priests, but rather with one another. This conversation can be characterized not by the question, how did the natives experience their conversion to Christianity, but rather, what is happening to us in the here and now? And what are we going to do about what is happening to us? These questions would have certainly occurred to anyone who had experienced or who had known those who had experienced the arrival of the Europeans to the Philippines and the East Indies. The shaman here, for example, did not have to depend wholly on native gods and spirits to sense a change in the wind with the arrival of Europeans to the Philippines. As this year's commemoration of Magellan's attempted circumnavigation of the globe indicates, natives had known about the existence of Spain and the Spaniards since at least 1521. But even prior to this event, island societies had been engaging in commerce and trade throughout the region for centuries. Mindoro received traders from commerce of the Islamized kingdoms of Brunei and Ternate, and many parts of Mindanao had been converted to Islam. Muslim sultanates had established settlements all throughout the southern parts of the archipelago, even all the way to Tondo, near Manila in Luzon. The island of Bohol was already part of an Islamized polity or Kedatuan based in Dapitan on the Zamboangan Peninsula of Mindanao, the southernmost island in the Philippines today. From a perspective outside Father Quirino's then, the question of whether or not Cariapa was possessed by the devil becomes secondary to the question of how conscious she must have been about the activities of the Portuguese, Spaniards, and Muslim kingdoms in Borneo throughout the first part of the 16th century. Yet in Quirino's almost seamless transition from anecdote to interpretation, the author instead stages a Christian phantasmagoria of spiritual conquest, the devil as a universal enemy, speaking through spirits or diwata, according to the natives' presumably primitive beliefs, the community showing itself ready to disavow their traditions in order to welcome Christianity, the imminent arrival of the missionary priest who will deliver an evangelium of universal salvation, etc. But in the sutured gap between one form of experience and another, we also glimpse the cultural and psychological effects of social anomie throughout the colonial period under the mantle of spiritual conquest. Quirino's narrative wants us to believe that Cariapa's prophecy was wrong, but what do we make of those who may have considered that perhaps she was right? This original question in Father Quirino's account, what is happening to us, finds echoes in the tale of a weeping God recounted by Dominican missionary Father Diego de Aduarte's 1641 Chronicle of the Dominican Order. Much of this history takes place in northern Luzon, which was the main area of evangelization assigned to the Dominicans when they arrived in 1587. The region of Pangasinan, which you should see on the slide here, which literally translates into the place of salts or forced salts, lies on the northwest coast of the island of Luzon, some 200 kilometers north of the Spanish settlement Intramuros in Manila. We know it was also the site of a pre-colonial sovereign Philippine polity, Caboloan, recorded in the Chinese annals as the Huangdom Fengqia Silan, which engaged in trade relations with the Ming dynasty in China, as well as the Ryukyu kingdom, which included Okinawa and the Ashikaga shogunate in Japan. In 1571, the Mexican Creole and nephew of Admiral Legazpi, Captain Juan de Salcedo, conducted a military expedition throughout the interior of northern Luzon, this region where many native groups succeeded in resisting or severely limiting the encroachment of colonial society throughout the entire duration of Spanish rule. Salcedo encountered 3 Japanese vessels here, which fled, and the natives of the nearby settlement promptly decided to burn their houses and retreat. And pursuing them, Salcedo eventually came to the trading colony of Agoo on the north side of Lingayen Gulf, contemporary province of La Union, where Chinese, Japanese, and Ryukyuan merchants traded their wares with native groups upriver for gold. It is for this reason that Miguel de Loarca called Agoo Japan's port, Puerto del Japón. Then in 1574, several years after the establishment of the Spaniards in Intramuros, the Chinese pirate Limahong attempted to seize Manila and establish a kingdom there. In failing this, he and his crew raided and took over Caboloan or Pangasinan with the intention of using it as the basis of pirate raids. A military campaign led by Salcedo and consisting of Tagalog and Visayan recruits from the south, as well as Mexicans and the Philippines, succeeded in unseating the pirate, thereby further facilitating Spanish expansion into the northern part of the island. Before the arrival of the Dominicans in Pangasinan, the natives had rebuffed earlier attempts to penetrate the interior of the island by the Augustinian and Franciscan orders. Given the tumultuous history of colonization in the region, it should come as no surprise that friars had a difficult time attracting natives to the Catholic faith with the few resources that they had. Even after the Augustinian order was forced to allow the arrival of the other religious missionary orders to the Philippines in order to preach Christianity, the resettlement and conversion of the natives seemed a formidable task. As Duarte narrates about the missions in northern Luzon, quote, although there were secular priests and Franciscan missionaries desirous of the natives' efforts, their own efforts have never borne any fruit due to the natives' great resistance. The natives have remained wretchedly victorious, and with their contradictions, they forced the ministers to depart, the latter leaving the natives in their darkness, which they held so dear, end quote. It was around the time of the Dominicans' arrival that a troop of natives, or indios, from below, meaning the pacified Tagalog or Pampangan territories closer to Manila. This troop was traveling through a densely forested area en route to conduct some unspecified routine business with the unchristianized Igorot mountain tribes to the east of Pangasinan. As Father Duarte relates, the members of the party heard a terrible voice wailing in the forest just beyond range of sight. Yet the attempts of the troop to discern the source of the lament remained fruitless. Finally, a member of the company dared to address the voice and inquire the reasons after of its laments. The voice identified itself as Apo Laki, or Great Lord, who, Duarte says, among them is akin to Mars among the Roman Gentiles, or the god of war whom they call when they travel by sea or engage in their daily business, end quote. This set the natives in a panic until one of the braver ones asked, quote, Apo Laki, O Anito of ours, to whom we have dedicated sacred festivals, what reason have we given you cause to fear as we have not offended you, end quote. The word Anito, also common to various Philippine languages, and in this case, both Tagalog and Pangasinense, refers to an ancestral or divine spirit, both of whom are worshipped and venerated. To the natives' query, the god replies, I'll read the English translation, I cry for seeing fulfilled what I have feared for years, that you would welcome foreigners with white teeth and cowled. I will no longer go among you in search of those who will follow me, since you left me for foreigners, I who was once your ancient lord, end quote. After years of encroachment by religious missionaries, Duarte here implies, the native spirits and ancestors were finally preparing to abandon their people. This is a theme to which Duarte's history, obsessed as it is with exposing the devil's presence behind every native form of veneration and belief, returns again and again. In another example, where Duarte describes the task of missionaries to uncover and destroy the small huts that the natives built in remote areas in order to practice ritual sacrifice, he reports eyewitness accounts of devils howling in the cultivated plots or cementeras. And this is a rather extensive quote, so I'm not going to read the entire one, but it sort of describes the these eyewitness accounts of natives hearing these spirits howling in the wilderness as they were being cast out by the religious missionaries. Duarte's narrative here conforms more or less with Quirino's. Both of these, in turn, contributed to the articulation of a coherent narrative of spiritual conquest promoted by Quirino and Duarte and developed by the likes of other missionaries. Yet while Duarte's stories of weeping gods and anitos, with Apolaki being the first among them, dramatizes the efficacy of Christian ministers before the pagan world, they also invite the careful reader to pursue a series of unanswered questions. What kind of business did the Christianized lowlanders have with the highland Igorot tribes in the first place, particularly at a time when the Spanish encomenderos and missionaries had prohibited such interactions in the interests of forced settlement or reduction? More importantly, why did Apolaki appear and communicate his message to these lowlanders instead of the Pangasinense people whose towns and villages were ostensibly, and at that moment, beset by the pressure to convert to Christianity? Could there have been a non-rhetorical question embedded in the god's laments, not along the lines of, why do you no longer follow me, but rather, will you also, or once again, follow me? Like Father Quirino before him, Duarte was careful to record the god's words, but perhaps he should have also considered recording the natives' responses. The background history of this northern region of Luzon tells us why such responses could tell us more about the spiritual conquest than Father Duarte's own speculations. For neither the people of Pangasinan nor the Christianized populations from central Luzon lived in total darkness and ignorance of the larger world across the ocean prior to the Spanish arrival. Seen in this way, the weeping god in Duarte's chronicle recounts not so much a sign of confirmation that the inevitable and destined Christianization of the archipelago was happening. Rather, it betrays the author's belabored staging of a scene, the scene of conversion. Behind the masks and props, however, Duarte's narrator also registers a collective lament shared by both the indigenous groups who recognized Apolaki and the cosmogony his existence implied, as well as the visitors from the colonized areas around Intramuros in Manila. Both groups bore witness to an unprecedented social transformation that had left their gods in limbo. Neither efficacious nor entirely dispelled or demystified, the flight of the gods and the ensuing years of wandering had become an enigma for natives to ponder. The range of possible answers to the questions that arise, in any case, paints a more complex picture of Spanish colonization of Luzon and the archipelago in the 17th century. Complex in the sense that what Duarte obscures or ignores seems to be of equal importance to what he has included. On the surface, both Quirino and Duarte's accounts contribute to a general theme that anchors the overarching narrative of spiritual conquest. In the light of history we now know, however, these anecdotes begin to reveal a different story, one characterized by native loss, deracination, forced and unwilling abjuration of popular beliefs and conception, and a profound collective sense of perplexity regarding the future. In the case of the native settlements in Agoo and Lingayen, after the Spanish arrival, these ports were closed to inter-Asian trade. Agoo became the center of military campaigns to pacify the native tribes of the northern Cordillera mountain provinces, and Pangasinan went from being a trading partner with China and Japan to a frontier missionary outpost and province for those who come from below. But in the colonial borderlands or netherworld between highlands and lowlands, gods like Apolaki weighed their future against the sporadic penetration of Christian missions and later churches under the administration of the friars. And Apolaki's worshippers, far from hastening to adopt Spanish suzerainty, became subjects of a protracted, that is to say, perpetually unfinished and partial colonialism. So in closing, I'd like to bring these anecdotes of a weeping shaman and god around to reflect on the series of questions posed by the conference organizers regarding the nature of anniversaries and quincentennials. To quote, what should the overarching narrative of these histories be? What do we want to celebrate on this anniversary? What is its significance in the lives of Filipinexes and our colonizers today? End quote. Certainly tales like those of Cariapa and Apolaki present us with precious little material to create anything like an overarching narrative. What they do offer us, however, is a remainder and a reminder that people and populations often live and die without the comfort of overarching narratives, religious or historical, but rather in our constant struggles to bracket them or have those narratives accommodate our lives and our futures. These struggles take place in our quotidian attempts to embed irreducible pockets of memory and meaning into the historical continuum, which anchor us to the present and clear a space for imagining life tomorrow. Philippine national artist Nick Joaquin captured this insight well in his novel, The Woman Who Had Two Navels, during the climactic encounter he stages between the figures representing the Philippine past and present. At the end of the novel, the elder revolutionary and exile, Dr. Monson, awakens from his disillusionment and false hopes regarding Philippine independence. While he laments the defeat of the Philippine Revolution at the hands of the Americans, and with it, the fading of the Philippines' appointment with historical destiny in an overarching narrative, he nevertheless also realizes that most people still remain willing to die, quote, not for a great public future, but a small private past, not for a flag or a people, but just for one town, one street, one house, for the sound of a canal in the morning, the look of some roofs in the noon sun, and the fragrance of a certain evening flower, end quote. And sometimes, more than sometimes, the remaindered past of weeping gods and shamans finds its way into the present. The memory of Apolaki, for example, managed to outlast the overarching narrative that Father Duarte promoted in his Chronicle of Spiritual Conquest. Almost 50 years after Duarte's death, Apolaki turns up in an investigation launched by the Dominicans in Bolinao, Pangasinan, where the entire settlement gives testimony to the popular veneration of the Great Lord during the Corpus Christi festival in June. Closer to our own time, 2 years ago, in fact, a Filipino marine geophysicist, Jenny Ann Barreto, and her team gave the name Apolaki to the recently discovered largest known volcano in the world. It's an underwater volcano. You can see the scale of it in relationship to the northern island of Luzon, just to the west. Today, the name and figure of Apolaki appears in songs, video games, comic books, and even hotel resorts. Apolaki's survival in the popular memory, despite missionaries' repeated attempts to consign his name to oblivion, would make a fascinating history, one that, needless to say, exceeds the sketch that I've presented here. But such pockets of memory and meaning, which extend all the way to the 19th century and even today, and express themselves in rituals, festivals, cults of saints, textile patterns, and increasingly popular culture, would not have persisted without the existence of a frontier space throughout Spain's overseas kingdoms, and I would argue, at the margins of every overarching narrative of history. By frontier space, of course, I mean a space of exception, where laws either could not be implemented or in which laws existed in competition with other forms of authority. The commonness of such spaces throughout the whole of colonial history may in the end lead us to set aside the pursuit of a new narrative for now, in favor of multiple beginnings, encounters, and spin-offs of the as yet undiscovered past. With that, I close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Blanco. Next up, we have Professor Una Paredes.
Thank you, Theo. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak at this conference as part of this wonderful panel. Thank you so much. The title of my paper is Death on the Beach, Decolonizing Mactan's Pericolonial Moment. And I think you'll find a lot of, well, some overlap between mine and Jody's paper. In imagining, discussing, and portraying the arrival of Europeans in the Philippines, Filipinos tend to focus on dramatizing the moment of Ferdinand Magellan's demise at the hands of the native Lapulapu. This aligns with what I see as our fixation in the Philippines with the final violent moments of someone's life and deriving some kind of religious, political, supernatural, or other meaning from it. Famous deaths that are now significant to Filipinos include those of the national hero Jose Rizal, executed by Spanish troops, the political dissident Ninoy Aquino, famously assassinated at Manila International Airport, allegedly by gunman Rolando Galman, who himself was killed, the religious figure of Jesus Christ, whose death in exchange for mankind's salvation is a tenet of Christian faith, and among others, the SAF 44, who were massacred in the Mama Sapano clash, and the tragic deaths of the countless victims of extrajudicial killings under the current president, and those who were just as brutally salvaged under other previous presidents. Of the contemporary and historic deaths, ones, their deaths have been examined, debated, and commemorated and dramatized in various ways. Who can forget the portrayal of Antonio Luna's death at the hands of Emilio Aguinaldo's men as a live-action spoliarium in the 2015 film General Luna? The anthropologist Julius Bautista writes about the culture of death in the Philippines, and here I'm deliberately misusing the term since he was actually referencing the Catholic Church's framing of contraception, abortion, euthanasia, and other things contrary to church doctrine. But I use that phrase here because it seems obvious to me that we have a cultural epistemology that highlights death, especially violent death. Bautista notes this himself through the lens of Christian martyrdom. I quote, "The assassination of then opposition Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino in 1983 was a catalyst for the struggle against the Marcos regime, conceived through the idiom of Christian symbols and images. Ninoy's death became a national allegory that drew connections between the Passion of Christ, the self-sacrifice of Jose Rizal, the dark age that was martial law, and Ninoy himself as the latest in a pantheon of modern-day martyrs. His position in this pantheon is inscribed in his most poignant pronouncement that, quote, the Filipino is worth dying for, end quote, and another end quote. As we all know, the torturous crucifixion of Jesus and death of Jesus Christ is also infamously reenacted every year in some parts of the Philippines, sometimes quite realistically, by those who claim that this ritual mimesis brings them closer to his supernatural power. Now, I do not mean to frame the death of Magellan at the hands of my people, the Visayans, as anything but a justifiable homicide. To be clear, I'm not equating Magellan in any way with Jesus, Rizal, Aquino, the cinematic Luna, or anything else Filipinos might frame as martyrdom. I mean instead to remark on the way that that particular moment in time is seared into our collective memories, as well as in popular art, with the heroic, freedom-loving native chieftain Lapulapu slaying the white interloper Magellan with his kris or maybe a bolo on a sandy pre-colonial but soon-to-be colonized beach in Mactan as their field of battle. Maybe that's just because of the Yoyoy Villames song, but interestingly enough, the account by Pigafetta states that it was not Lapu-Lapu himself, but a large group of his warriors who slayed Magellan, first disabling him with a poisoned arrow through the leg, then finishing him off with spears and bolos. Magellan's reward for arrogantly inserting himself into local politics against a more experienced opponent. In any case, it seems that it's always this particular moment, that violent death, that matters, and not all the other less violent moments that came before or after. For it is a moment that simultaneously valorizes the anti-Spanish, anti-colonial tone of our national identity and pushes us off the pier into the waters of coloniality. Indeed, the blurb for this very conference opens by marking, or is it celebrating, Magellan's death on April 27, 500 years ago, explaining that, quote, this event marks the beginning of the European colonization of the Philippines, as well as the beginning of a proud tradition of Filipino resistance, end quote. In contrast, non-Filipino sources such as National Geographic describe Magellan as dying during a mere skirmish, as if significant only for preventing a European protagonist from completing his circumnavigation of the globe. In thinking of an otherwise random violent death on a beach as the often cited turning point in our coloniality as Filipinos, I started thinking of another loosely comparable voyager colonizer beach death at the hands of natives. That of Captain James Cook in 1779 at Kealakekua Bay on the Big Island of Hawaii, a death which Mark Twain referred to as justifiable homicide in his book Roughing It. There are debates about what premeditated Cook's death, such as whether the native Hawaiians saw him as a manifestation of the god Lono, who returned when he was not supposed to, or perhaps something more politically complex in the chain of events. But the analysis and interpretation of his death, whether as apotheosis or as anti-imperialist resistance or something else altogether, appears to be a fixation of Western scholars rather than an identity-making moment by Native Hawaiians themselves. At least it was before the big debate that erupted in the 1990s between anthropologists Marshall Salins and Gananath Obiasekre. Nonetheless, in popular historiography, both deaths signal a definite turn to coloniality. But I would like to argue against reinforcing the seemingly inevitable trajectory of these and other moments by situating them as pericolonial moments across both space and time. I was recently in a medieval studies seminar focusing on 1521, specifically when Magellan's crew completed its circumnavigation of the globe as the so-called blue marble moment when the world first became global. We can easily and critically problematize this statement by pointing out that this particular description of what constitutes a global world is definitely European in perspective. As with the common understanding of being modern, this sense of being global is delimited in a way that always requires circling back to Europe. But if we are to truly explore the past and decolonize our histories, especially histories of contact, it requires a very different perspective. And for this, I offer a pericolonial one from Southeast Asia. By pericolonial here, I want to be clear that I don't mean the colonial peripheries, but places that are colony or empire adjacent, both in terms of space and just as importantly, time. Southeast Asia as a cultural area, as a political region, has in its own way always been global, at least as global as it was possible at the time Magellan arrived. And I'm not talking about his 1521 arrival in what is now the Philippines, but his arrival a decade earlier in the region when he arrived in Malacca as a member of the crew with the expedition of Alfonso de Albuquerque, who would soon lay siege to Malacca. At the time, all trade between India and China had been passing through the Strait of Malacca for centuries. And during that period, Malacca itself was an already thriving multicultural merchant community of about 40,000, containing in its multitudes dozens of language groups and nationalities, including Malays, Chinese, Gujaratis, Javanese, Hindus from the Coromandel Coast, Arabians, Persians, Turks, Armenians, Bengali, Siamese, and Luzones, people from Luzon in what is now the Philippines, among others. So a global village by any reckoning. There were quite a few communities like this, though perhaps of smaller scale, all over the region at the time, because the globalization of Southeast Asia had already begun centuries before, driven primarily by trade and other forms of exchange rather than conquest and colonization. This includes the processes we referred to broadly as synicization and Indianization in Southeast Asian studies, as well as the later Indian Ocean trade and Nanyang trade, making the whole of island Southeast Asia pericolonial to both Indian and Chinese imperial aspirations, but incorporated by neither. Now, within this wider context, the sacking of Malacca by the Portuguese in 1511 is often used to mark a turning point in the telling of the history of Southeast Asia, as the opening salvo in what within a century would be the active colonization of the region by various European imperial powers. A decade after Malacca, Magellan would return to the region with a crew that in the Eurocentric narrative would complete the first circumnavigation of the globe. Incidentally, while in Malacca, Magellan in 1511 acquired as his slave a 14-year-old boy named Enrique, who, according to Pigafetta, was a native of Sumatra, which is just across the strait from Malacca. Enrique traveled with Magellan and his crew back to Europe and would later accompany Magellan and Sebastian Elcano on their journey to the Americas and then across the Pacific to what is now the Philippine archipelago. But back then, even the idea of something that could be called the Philippines did not exist. After Magellan's death, Enrique was eventually freed, and assuming he made it back home, our Southeast Asian Enrique, rather than the European Magellan, would have been the one to actually make the world truly global, for the midpoint of Magellan's voyage was already his ride back home. Alongside Mactan, I mention Malacca here because it exemplifies a common type of contact zone in Southeast Asia, a place of active exchange where economic, cultural, or other forms of meaningful interaction that operates autonomous of an overarching state or state-like power. This is the type of space that comes close to the particular conception of pericolonial space that I used in my book, A Mountain of Difference, which is about the indigenous or Lumad peoples of Mindanao Island in the early Spanish colonial period. I'd been looking for a way to talk about what I was seeing in the archival record about places like Mindanao, which had been claimed early on by the Spanish Empire as part of their colony. The record shows that multiple communities of Lumads and other natives were indeed interacting with colonial elements and were profoundly influenced by them, but were clearly not under colonial pressure. The same can also be said for every part of the archipelago that made contact with Magellan's expedition and with the next few expeditions that followed. Pratt's concept of the contact zone describes an area in which two or more cultures communicate and negotiate shared histories and power relations, making it, quote, a site for linguistic and cultural encounters, though specifically one wherein power is negotiated and struggle occurs in various ways, often in the context of asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, or their aftermaths. Now, perhaps this would apply to a place like Malacca in the early 16th century if we were discussing its internal social and political relations. Maybe that's more where the label was meant to be applied. But it definitely does not apply to Malacca's relations vis-a-vis externally vis-a-vis greater powers, such as an imperial one like Portugal, not even after they took it over. Instead, Malacca mostly continued to be Malacca, albeit under a parasitical form of colonialism. And I'm using this term with loose reference to the work of Ricardo Roque, in which the Portuguese slotted themselves into a pre-existing hub of commerce and cultural exchange in order to profit from it, both economically and in terms of its own imperial self-image. Same with the Dutch, who soon followed the Portuguese. Remarkably, Malacca retains its own distinct character to this day, despite centuries of foreign domination. The Lumads in Mindanao also retain their own distinct character, despite being awash in Spanish contact and influence, since at least the first Catholic mission was attempted in Butuan on the northeastern coast of Mindanao in 1596. Now, we tend to have this totalizing image in our heads of colonialism that it destroys and remakes the foundations of indigenous worlds. But from the work of Roque and others, we know that in reality, the colonizers also conform significantly to the indigenous world. Now, to me, this is clearly what happened in Mactan and in the other islands claimed by the Spanish Empire as a new colony they called Filipinas 500 years ago. Then again, what constitutes empire? In asking this question, we must ask not only where, but also when. When can a place be called a proper colony? Whenever the colonizer declares it so? When is an empire? When it's drawn out on a map? Or is it, as the comedian Eddie Izzard argues, when they have a flag? The historian of colonial India, Kim Wagner, told me that an empire is something that lives on a map that does not necessarily correspond to reality. Ricardo Padron and Miguel Lorenzo show us through cartographic history that empire, as imagined by the imperial powers themselves, is highly fluid both geographically and politically. Conversely, how it manifests on the ground, whether it manifests at all, in fact, is likewise highly fluid. That is to say, empire expands and contracts or otherwise shifts both across space and across time. And for something so formidable historiographically, there is an extraordinary fluidity to empire. Speaking of imperial shifts across time, much later in the Spanish colonial period, the Lumad areas of Mindanao and other places like it that we still think of as peripheral today, at least from the perspective of the colonial metropole in Manila and other colonial centers like Cebu, would definitely count as spaces in which cultures met and grappled with each other under conditions of highly asymmetrical relations of power, the dynamic through which colonial frontiers are typically constituted as a new kind of space. Of course, frontiers are not a frontier to people who are already in that space originally. Instead, with imperial or colonial shifts over time, and with new power relations introduced by new players and new external dynamics, as well as what William Henry Scott liked to call the magic of colonial alchemy, the formerly autonomous pericolonial spaces can and do eventually transform into an entirely new kind of space, a colonial periphery. Beyond such frontiers, would then lie the kinds of zones of refuge similar in function to the spaces in mainland Southeast Asia that Willem van Schendel calls zomia. These are places where people flee to escape the tyranny of the state, like James Scott's aspiring anarchists were purportedly compelled to do. Indeed, there are many examples from throughout the Spanish period of people in the Philippine archipelago fleeing to the uplands to escape taxation, to escape the long arm of the law, and other serious threats to their personal freedom, like pirates or say, Western civilization. Fleeing to the uplands has, to this day, been a fairly common strategy to avoid various similar dangers throughout insular Southeast Asia. But this kind of framing, with frontiers and zones of refuge, presumes and anticipates indigenous resistance, as well as requires a significant level of negative entanglement with state power and a deliberate centering of state or imperial power. A major problem I have with Zomia, with Scott's styling in particular, is that it, quote, refuses to prospect for any possibility of political negotiation as mutually beneficial, unquote, between peoples and states, as argued by by Hurley for Janssen. As such, it interprets indigenous agency as resistance by default. And this is not a condition that reflects the historical reality of many Southeast Asian spaces in the early 16th century, 500 years ago. In fact, part of the reason why I conceptualized pericolonial spaces was to get away from the resistance model, which to me has proven inadequate to describe the kind of social, political, and cultural dynamic I was seeing in both the archival and ethnographic records. As such, in my original formulation, pericolonial spaces constitute a type of contact zone, but specifically one that existed too far outside of the gravitational pull of colonial power to be characterized by asymmetrical relations of power. In this formulation, such places are not peripheries or frontiers, which by definition decenters them and by default privileges the colonial or imperial perspective. In referring to pericolonial spaces, I'm not talking about provincializing the metropole, but more like decoupling from it entirely. In an earlier article entitled Historicizing Modernity in Southeast Asia, Barbara Watson and Dyer revisits the idea of modernity as a recent condition tied almost exclusively to Western influence, broadly construed, and characterized by the concomitant weakening of traditional culture in its wake. She argues that Southeast Asia has long embodied the spirit of modernity, exemplified by, quote, the eagerness of Southeast Asian studies to link themselves with the outside, unquote. And doing this through travel and exploration, through the selective adoption and localization of imported elements into indigenous cultures, by the deliberate cultivation of cross-societal bonds, and what can be characterized as a generally open and very global outlook. The historical record describes people who moved from one culture to another and acted as conduits for the passage of ideas and influences. Not surprising for a region that had long placed a high value on being up to date, according to Andaya. As she explains, the selective, quote, the selective acquisition from the outside, which was a feature of Southeast Asian studies, was accompanied by an interest in learning about other societies and in comparing these with their own, unquote. As such, Europe was, quote, simply one of a number of potential sources for Southeast Asia's local modernizers, unquote. And perhaps the main thing that set Europeans apart in this multicultural context was the novel technologies they could offer. Even then, the European novelties were routinely localized to suit indigenous uses and cultural attitudes. For example, while Southeast Asians eagerly adopted the superior new European firearms of the time, it did not basically alter the way warfare was conducted, nor change cultural attitudes which attributed certain weapons with their own personality and spiritual power. In fact, this kind of dynamic was captured very elegantly in Vicente Rafael's Contracting Colonialism, in which instead of firearms, deals with Christianity as a spiritual technology. To be sure, the regional propensity for the new and the now has long been recognized within Southeast Asian studies as culturally and historically characteristic of the region long before 1521. This was the kind of global dynamic possible in the pericolonial spaces of island Southeast Asia that not only survived but even thrived despite the seemingly hegemonic coloniality of the post-Magellan world. Because Southeast Asia has been in a global contact moment for a very, very long time now, perhaps even for thousands of years, long before Europe would begin to look outward with intention. But pericoloniality is also a quality of time, and the temporal positionality of events like the sacking of Malacca and Magellan's voyage and the Battle of Mactan really matters here. Because we are viewing these events in retrospect, we tend to find it nearly impossible to dissociate them from coloniality. The default is to view the arc of this history as a trajectory instead, making colonialism and coloniality overwhelming, inevitable, fate. Instead, I caution that an agenda of decolonial reimagining might end up reinforcing inadvertently both coloniality and the Eurocentric narrative, and ultimately validating it within a deliberately contra-colonial regime that is supposed to be destabilizing it. Michael C. Hawkins, author of Making Moros, argues that we cannot achieve indigenous agency in Southeast Asian historiography by framing our histories as having been disrupted by coloniality. This is in response to an uncomfortable dilemma in our modern regional history. And I'm quoting from Hawkins here. In choosing to analyze the region through a prism of deterministic imperial impact and corresponding indigenous response, one is required to, at least tacitly, accept notions of indomitable Western hegemony and native passivity, thus sacrificing prospects of self-conscious and self-determining aboriginal agency, end quote. Again, I argue here for a pericolonial perspective in which we contextualize these events as, yes, colony or empire adjacent in terms of chronology, but not in a way that is deterministic of coloniality. This aspect might seem intuitive as a corrective to the Eurocentric historiography that continues to frame long-standing efforts from Filipino historians to indigenize and decolonize, efforts that have been going on for decades in a variety of iterations. But there is more to it than that. And again, quoting Hawkins, he says, Southeast Asian history must be viewed as a long series of interrelated but ultimately discursive processes which followed no predetermined theological pattern to modern fulfillment. Further, as a perpetually dynamic entity composed of innumerable internal and external historical variables, Southeast Asia must not be regarded as any kind of historically encoded natural or abnormal entity resulting from normal or deviant historical trajectories. Rather, Southeast Asia must be seen as a historical matrix composed of millions of heterogeneous processes and historical actors responding to various stimuli in an attempt to order and manage the world as it occurs, end quote. Now, you could just sort of rethink that quote, substituting the word Philippines for Southeast Asia. So in referring to pericolonial time, I'm not talking about responding to Eurocentric ontologies and chronologies, but decoupling from them entirely, not as resistance or even decolonization, but reconceptualizing a past decoupled from coloniality in order to approach it in the present, in order to see Magellan's demise in Mactan as just a random death of a random foreigner that happened in the course of far more important things in the much grander archipelagic reality of Southeast Asia. And I'd like to end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Paredes. Our final panelist is Professor Vicente Rafael.
Thanks very much, Theo. And first of all, I just want to make sure can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. My talk is a little bit out of the assigned topic, or at least it seems that way. But after hearing Jody Blanco's and Una Paredes' wonderful papers, it occurs to me that a central figure of my talk today, which is the President Rodrigo Duterte, can be thought of in terms of a pre-colonial, post-colonial, as well as a pericolonial phenomenon. And we can talk about that later, maybe after my talk. A lot has been written about Duterte in terms of the violence of his regime, especially around the drug war. But much less has been said about the sources of his symbolic authority. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about where that symbolic authority comes from. How does he manage to occupy such a central place in the imaginative life of Filipinos, both supporters and critics alike? One of the ways I want to suggest that he does so is through his stories and his jokes. Duterte is widely known for his irreverence and bawdy humor that constitute important elements of his governing style. The stories reveal a reliance on invective and an obsession with obscenity. And here, can we have the first slide, please? He is given to generously sprinkling his speeches with cuss words such as putangina, or son of a bitch, which can also be translated as motherfucker and fuck you, at times accompanied with a middle finger directed at his critics. He also makes frequent references to genitalia, as well as his critics, to the delight of his listeners. He revels in what Ashio Mbembe calls an aesthetic of vulgarity that has the effect of establishing a relationship of conviviality between himself and his audience. What results, again drawing from Mbembe, is an intimate tyranny, much of it centered on the tales of his phallus as it encounters the world. For example, in one of his campaign events in April 2016, Duterte addressed the Makati Business Club, made up of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. Rather than talk about his economic policies, he regaled the predominantly older male audience with stories of using Viagra. Next slide, please. Well, I'm separated from my wife, annulled, so I'm not useless. I'm not paralyzed. What am I supposed to do with my goddamn thing down there? Let it hang forever? Well, there's no drama going on. I drank Viagra and then it stood up. Oh, let's not kid ourselves. I'm giving it to you raw. I thought we were all the same age here, close quote. Back to me. Here, Duterte shares with men of a certain age and considerable influence a story about his experience of emasculation followed by his rejuvenation. Thanks to appeal, he regains his heart-on, the material evidence of his phallic power that he thought he had lost. Laughter ensues as he discursively shows to the men a part of himself that should have been hidden. His obscenity consists of making the private public, reaching below to connect with those above. It is his sexual politics from below that binds Duterte to those men along with a sprinkling of women who joins in the laughter. Together they share a common fantasy about the authoritarian phallus as something that they can imaginatively access, and the prospective pleasures of a drug-induced erection, beginning with that of Duterte's. But as we shall see in other examples below, the presidential phallus comes across not only as an instrument of pleasure, but also as a sign of terror. In another campaign stop at a large sports complex in Quezon City around the same time, Duterte tells a story that reverberated around the world. While he was mayor of Davao in 1989, there occurred a bloody prison siege in Davao City. Among the dead was one of the hostages taken by the prisoners, a 36-year-old Australian missionary, Jacqueline Hamill. According to Duterte, she was repeatedly raped by prisoners, along with the other women hostages before being killed. But rather than evoke pathos, the sight of Hamill's corpse steers desire in the mayor. All the women were raped. This is what he says in the next slide, please. All the women were raped, so during the first assault, because they retreated, the bodies they used as shields, one of them was the corpse of an Australian woman lay minister, Tisk. This is the problem. When the bodies were brought out, they were wrapped. I looked at her face. Son of a bitch. She looked like a beautiful American actress. Son of a bitch. What a waste. What came to mind was they raped her. They took turns. I was angry because she was raped. That's one thing. But she was so beautiful, the mayor should have gone first. Son of a bitch. What a waste. Sayang. Back to me. Hamill's rape and death is used by Duterte as a setup for a joke about himself, more specifically about the arousal and frustration of his lust. He sees her dead body in her beautiful face, and he feels that he should have been the first in line to assault her. Instead, he comes too late and so isn't able to come at all. It is his failure to assert his claim on the woman's body that is presumably taken by his audience as the object of hilarity. Seeing her dead body fills him with neither rage nor grief, but with a desire that cannot be fulfilled. He is unable to discharge his authority, as it were. The horror of the scene is thus displaced into a story about the mayor lamenting the failure of his phallic power. Rather than an erectile victory celebrated in the first story, the second ends with a punchline, sayang, what a pity, preceded by the cuss word, putang ina. But all is not lost. Duterte's disclosure of desire unfulfilled and phallic authority undercut produces a payback. The audience laughs, and their laughter compensated for his lost power. It returns to him both the pleasure and authority that the dead prisoners and the women's corpses had deprived him. Unable to pull rank, the mayor is nonetheless rewarded with the people's recognition of his narrative performance. Reports of the story drew sharp rebukes from feminists, human rights advocates, the Australian and US Embassy, and many other quarters. But among most of the electorate, his popularity soared, horrifying his critics, but delighting his supporters with his pungent shamelessness. Duterte's bad language and obscene stories were crucial in propelling him to the presidency. In tracking his jokes, we can see a set of obsessions built around the question: who gets to own the phallus? Who gets to wield it and for what purpose? Here, the phallus should be understood less as a biological thing, synonymous with a penis, as a symbolic weapon for asserting autocratic authority and patriarchal prerogatives over women and men alike, like guns, cars, or wealth. The phallus can be used to impress and to threaten, to unify and disperse, to induce pleasure, but also to coerce submission. Duterte routinely threatens to castrate his opponents, even as he repeatedly reveals his generous endowment. Used to avenge imagined hurts and shore up a fragile ego, Duterte's phallus proved effective in shutting down his opposition. The presidential phallus, however, is far from being an unassailable force. As we saw in the rape story above, it can also be blunted by other men and women whose death frustrated Duterte's assertion of his privileges. Indeed, Duterte is notorious for joking about rape as a way of reasserting his ability to police women's behavior and enlist men into affirming the sexism that buttresses his authoritarian imagination. Hence, when critics point out that contrary to his claims, crime in Davao while he was a mayor has gone up, especially rape, he retorts that wherever there are beautiful women, there will be plenty of rape. Along the same lines, he also spoke approvingly of men who had, quote, the balls to rape candidates for Miss Universe in exchange for facing certain punishment. Women are raped not simply because they are women for Duterte, it is because they are beautiful. It is as if their beauty is a challenge that has to be faced down, a provocation that must be put in its proper place, under the rule and in the service of the phallus. The philosopher Kate Mann's description of misogyny is useful in understanding Duterte. She writes, next slide, please. Misogyny is what happens when women break ranks or roles and disrupt the patriarchal order. They tend to be perceived as uppity, unruly, out of line, or insubordinate. Misogyny isn't simply hateful. It imposes social costs on non-compliant women. Think of misogyny then as the law enforcement branch of a patriarchal order. This makes for a useful, if rough, contrast between misogyny and sexism. Whereas misogyny upholds the social norms of patriarchy by patrolling and policing them, sexism serves to justify these norms, largely via an ideology of supposedly natural differences between men and women with respect to their talents, interests, proclivities, and appetites. Sexism is bookish. Misogyny is combative. Sexism is complacent. Misogyny is anxious. Sexism has a theory. Misogyny wields a cudgel. Close quote. Back to me. In joking about rape, Duterte upholds patriarchal norms and sexist attitudes by wielding the cudgel of misogyny. And that cudgel is the phallus, at once combative and anxious, always wary of challenges and eager to assert itself. One particularly disturbing story that illustrates the law enforcement role of misogyny involves Duterte encouraging soldiers, when confronted with the communist female fighters, to spare their lives but to shoot them in their vagina. Quote, "There's a new order coming from the mayor. We won't kill you. We will just shoot your vagina, so that if she has no vagina, she would be useless," close quote. Shooting them in their vagina was, in a way, taking away what made them women. It was the punishment for taking up arms, defying the state. It amounted to castrating those who challenged patriarchal norms, integral to the exercise of its authority. Hence, we see how Duterte's misogyny is directed not at every woman, but at particular women who attempt to seize the phallus for themselves, daring to go against his political and sexual authority. Duterte's phallic power is directed, however, not just at women, but as we saw above, at other men to make sure that they too fall in line. For example, while campaigning for senatorial candidates during the midterm elections of 2018, Duterte extolled the size of his penis in order to set him apart from the ugly candidates running in the opposition. While one's character is important, penis size, he claimed, was crucial. Had God given him a small penis, he continued, he would have gone to the church altar and cut it off, saying, "Son of a bitch, this is all you've given me?" Close quote. Encouraged by the crowd's laughter, he then recalled how he would walk around naked in the hallways of the YWCA as a young man. While everyone else covered up with a towel, he went about proudly displaying his junk. The other residents would look on in admiration. Quote, next slide, please. They tell me, "Son of a bitch, Duterte, you're so hard." I think this isn't the slide, sorry. "Son of a bitch, Duterte, you're so hard. When I was young, my penis almost looked up to the sky," moving the microphone upwards to make the point. Its head would reach almost to his belly. "I'm very thankful to my father. At least he let me out into the world highly equipped." He finishes by recalling how women at a local bordello were shocked at the sight of his member. "They ran away," they said, referring to me. "We don't like him. That skinny guy. He won't stop having sex," close quote. In his youth, Duterte claims he literally stood out, creating a vivid impression among both men and women. While men envied his penis, women, however, ran away in fright. Wishing to have a phallus like his, the other men acknowledged Duterte's possession of the power precisely for the respect it arouses in other men and the fear of sexual violence it steers among women. Merging masculinity with misogyny, Duterte's phallocentric politics is central to his authoritarian imagination, using the image of his penis to put both men and women in their putative places. This brings to mind Helene Cixous, quote, "Within the phallocratic apparatus, women are subordinated and defined by lack, while men are given the grotesque and unenviable fate of being reduced to a single idol with balls of clay," close quote. We can further see Duterte's phallocentric politics at work in the following example. In a speech he gave in 2019, Duterte reacted to the rumors that he had had a kidney transplant and was dying from colon cancer. The target of his ire was Kit Tatad, former cabinet minister during the Marcos regime and a major figure in the ultra-conservative Catholic sect Opus Dei. In his newspaper column, he had written about Duterte's illness and frequent absences from public view, suggesting that he was on the verge of dying. Duterte responded by saying, next slide, please. "This Tata, he said, my day is coming, that I was confined, serious, in and out of the hospital with colon cancer. Nearly every day he was going on and on. You read the newspaper. I mean, how unfair can you get? Every day, even I started to believe him. So one day as I undressed to take a shower, without my underwear, I held my anus. I smelled it, smelled like shit and not some other. He said I was already dead. So I hit back. I said, next slide. I said, this Tata, you Tata, son of a bitch. I would admit it if I were sick. You son of a bitch, you have a serious case for 30 years of diabetes. You and your dick can no longer raise this microphone to laughter and applause. When you have diabetes, 30 years, drops microphone, laughter. No more. So I said, let me borrow your wife for one night. I'll let her hold my body. Go on. Your insult hurt a lot. You son of a bitch, you're asking for it. You said I was rude. Well, son of a bitch, that's true. You said I was no statesman. Well, that's true. Close quote. The president has always been particularly sensitive about rumors regarding his health, despite the fact that his various illnesses have been widely reported, and takes particular umbrage at those who suggest that he's close to death's door. Duterte takes his revenge in the form of returning Tatad's putative insults with interest. But he takes his time getting there. He recaps the rumor, acknowledging its power to compel belief through its repeated circulation. To make sure that he doesn't have colon cancer, he talks about poking around his anus and smelling his fingers, reassuring himself that it smelled of shit rather than some other cancerous odor. Discursively exposing his anus, he also exposes himself not only to the possibility of being sick, but also to the possibility of being duped. Assured that his anal stink is nothing out of the ordinary, he goes on the attack. Punctuating his remarks with crisp invectives, He points out that it is in fact Tata who has been ill with diabetes for many years and as a result can no longer get his dick or uten up. The consummate performer that he is, Duterte makes a point of illustrating this with the use of a microphone as a prop. He lifts it up and down to show contrast between what he can do with his penis and what Tata can no longer do with his. He goes from exploring his anus to scrutinizing his penis, linking the two as signs of his good health. And to clinch his case, he asks to borrow Tatad's wife so she can verify the hardness of his erection as compared to the flaccidness of Tatad's. His mouth and anus come to the aid of the presidential phallus. Together, they marshal a barrage of obscenities that meets with the laughter and applause of his audience. In this way, Duterte effectively unmans his opponent. Tatad's stories depicted Duterte in a state of bodily crises. Feeling aggrieved, the president hits back, showing that in fact he remains in command, beginning with his control of the narrative and his ability to reverse its target. Returning the insult with interest, Duterte draws a third person into the scene, Tatad's wife, who is pictured as complicit in Duterte's revenge, in effect cuckolding her husband with the invitation for her to grasp his thing. Freud once posed the question, when we laugh at jokes, what are we laughing at? Are we responding to the technique of joke telling or to the content of the joke or to both? It is never clear, Freud says, to the extent that jokes like dreams are fulfillments of the same wish to evade repression. Quote, the joke will evade restrictions and open sources of pleasure that have become inaccessible. It will further bribe the hearer with its yield of pleasure into taking sides with us without very close investigation. Reason, critical judgment, suppression. These are the forces against which a joke fights in succession, close quote. The political significance of jokes, the fact that they go against the grain of the reasonable and the normal, would seem to make them valuable resources for the oppressed seeking to overthrow the weight of authority. Mikhail Batin further argues that medieval celebrations like the carnival and modern literary forms like the novel were sites for upending the hierarchy through satire, disguise, and social inversions. The high is brought down low and the low is elevated, especially parts of the body and its functions. Bribing his audience, Duterte is like a smuggler of illicit goods, promising forbidden pleasures and overturning repressive strictures. He says what they would have wanted to say but could not. Their laughter could thus be read as a sign of their identification with him. In looking at the narrative structure of his jokes, we see how it hinges not only in the classic techniques of joke telling, those of condensation and displacement, as in dreams, it is also productive of a hierarchy of listening, whereby Duterte is as the teller monopolizes the time and language of telling. As part of the audience, you have no choice but to wait for him, and he is always late. Then listen to him, take his time unspooling his tales. Unable to leave without drawing his ire, you remain a captive audience. Jokes then becomes a way of establishing his authority. He exposes himself, renders himself vulnerable, and risks dissolving his authority, but only to recover and reassert his mastery over the scene of exposure. This dialectic of disclosure and domination allows him to forge a tyranny of intimacy, extracting your consent registered by your laughter. Humor is just a means of playing out his anxiety while assuaging his fear. Vulgarity is stylized and obscenity performed to release the audience's inhibitions at defying conventions. But this defiance is bogus and deeply conservative, since it always comes with a price of submission to Duterte's authoritarian imagination. While laughter creates conviviality and community, it is always shadowed by violence and fear. This has to do with the phallic power that Duterte seeks to grasp and wield when he addresses those he considers critical of him, such as women and lesser men, and especially abject figures of criminality like drug dealers and users. Recklessly cussing at them, he lusts after their deaths, brooking neither dissent nor opposition. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you all for the presentations. And now we can begin a conversation which I'm expecting will be really quite stimulating and fruitful. And first, thanks to the organizers of this conference, because it's really a fascinating way to commemorate the 500 years. And we have to interrogate the notion of what that commemoration means. And so if you'll indulge me a moment, in 2019, I had a chance to travel to Spain for a work trip. And what I found interesting was that it was not 1521 that they were commemorating. It was really 1519, the launch of Magellan's voyage. And what was fascinating about that is that in their memory, the collective Spanish memory of that particular event, the launch of that voyage was really equated with their moonshot. So if you could see several images play out in different museums and the video materials and assets that are developed. What I found fascinating is that, as the caravels are launching their way out into the sea, there's a split screen with the U.S. space shuttle launching, and so it's equated with this grand space challenge that to them has been really unmatched, unrivaled, and that's the point of celebration for them. It's the launch, not necessarily the fact that he didn't make his way back home in 1521. So I find that this is interesting because in thinking about commemoration, I take to heart the presentations here, especially seeing Una's paper as a proper frame for us, this notion of pericoloniality. I recall the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival. And in 1992, I'm sure many of you will remember, there were several publications that tried to answer that particular moment. And that 500 years of the landing in the so-called New World. There were a couple of publications that really stood out. And one was 1992's American Holocaust by David Stannard. And the following year, Haunanike Trask's From a Native Daughter. Both seemed to me a kind of a direct answer to the celebratory mode of the time, that there was much celebration going on with the 500th, and that these two particular scholars wanted to be able to find a moment for a counter memory. And they were trying to deliver the notion that counter memory is absolutely necessary. So we have to get to this question because Una raises it in a really challenging way. Is counter memory enough? Is it enough to just merely overturn a colonial narrative and replace it with an anti-colonial? And if it's not enough, to merely resist the teleology, or as Jody puts it, which is really quite fascinating, it says that we often live and die without the comfort of overarching narratives. What we have left then are the scraps of these processes within the matrices that Una reminds us of through Michael Hawkins' work, this matrix of processes. Could the question here, the first question here, could Enrique, that sailor, that young 14-year-old boy in Malacca, who was grabbed out of Malacca in 1511, or Cariapa, could these two be our pericolonial guides when we think about this particular history? What does that mean for them to be our pericolonial guides? What are they pointing us to? Are they pointing us to something else other than the beginning of a Philippine history? I mean, that's usually what we think about when we think about Lapulapu, right? He's on the military insignia of the Philippine National Police, often understood as the first Filipino, right? With that act in 1521. But if it's not him, and we reject that, and we think about someone like Cariapa or someone like Enrique, what do they represent as a kind of guide for pericoloniality? And then to Vince, thank you for the R-rated presentation. That was really fascinating. Loved it. How can we think of Dutertismo as a version of pericoloniality? How does that speak to this ongoing tradition within Southeast Asia as we unpack that? So we'll get to Vince's answer in a minute, but I'd like to hear from Una and Jody about the idea of Cariapa and Enrique, kind of setting us up for them as a kind of pericolonial guide. What would that exhibition look like in a museum?
I don't know. You want to go first, Jody?
Good job.
Alphabetical order.
Yes,
Alphabetical order.
The comparison that you drew, Theo, I think is really instructive, to think about the quincentennial of Columbus, and then this new sort of, it's not a quincentennial, I don't even know what you would say it, but of Magellan. And, you know, to think about kind of the different, I think the different mood or the different temper that really conditions the different receptions. I mean, you know, with Columbus, you know, there was such this kind of, you know, debate. Really, it sort of set off the debates. And, you know, I mean, this is actually also happening in the wake of two other significant developments and of global reach, you know, one of which was the creation and invention of the internet, and the other was you know, the fall of the Soviet Union and the sort of the breakup of the Soviet bloc. And this all happens in the late 80s, early 90s, around the time of that centennial of Columbus. And I think that that's kind of significant because, you know, when you look at like the 30 or 40 years that have passed, since 30 years have passed since then, you know, I just feel like we're really in such a different moment where the task of kind of producing the counter narrative, the overarching counter narrative, in many ways is kind of seeded. You know, when you look at like this internet generation, for example, the question that they're after is not a new author or a new sort of authoritative source, but rather, you know, how one source can feed into other sources, can feed into other sources, and you can create and undismantle and remake your narrative.
Hyperlinks.
Yeah, as you go along. And so, I mean, I think that just that mentality, I mean, even in my own classes, you know, one of the things that they've been asking us to do in the Zoom sort of format of classes is that they, you know, the trainers are always telling us, don't think of yourselves as teachers, but like as curators, you know, like you're just there to provide the material, put it up online, and have them kind of explore it in the way and put it together in the way that they'll put it together. And so I think that there's something about that mentality that I think is really different, that, you know, we can bring kind of, you know, all histories of the past are really histories of the present. And I think that, you know, just sort of having that front and center in terms of what exactly we are commemorating or celebrating today, to me, that's, you know, one of the things that's really, you know, foremost in my mind is how, you know, these kinds of stories don't have, we shouldn't feel like they are burdened with like creating the new narrative, because, you know, we miss the boat on the grand narratives, you know, over and over and over again. And I think that, you know, there's one thing that the history of the Philippines really shows is like, you know, missing the boat with historical destiny, you know. And I think that maybe, I don't know, we have to kind of get to a moment where we sort of think beyond that, and we think about, okay, well, that happened. What else can we do? And so it's kind of like it's really with that sort of simple premise that I think we can start mounting less a counter narrative or a counter argument than an ensemble, and also a kind of a corresponding ethic to be able to allow people and guide people in the construction and dismantling of narratives.
Una.
Okay. Yeah, you know, to the question of whether Enrique would make a good pericolonial guide, I think that that's maybe the wrong question to ask, because what would he be guiding us through, or guiding, say, Magellan through? You know, I think back then, I mean, we didn't really have. I wouldn't say that there was really an overarching sort of political power or anything like that. There was trying to kind of understand the past more in archipelagic terms, being influenced by this anthropologist, I mean, Andrew Carruthers at Penn, who's talking about archipelagic thinking and relationality. And he's drawing from Caribbean studies to talk about that, the work of Edward Glissant, but which I haven't really read fully or anything. But the idea that, you know, political and other relations, you know, in this sort of archipelagic reality really has to do with one-to-one relations, rather than this sort of kind of more imperial kind of overarching kind of like, there is this space that someone like Enrique or somebody else would lead others through. I would say Enrique as interlocutor definitely of
Mhm.
both, going both ways, but only one of many.
Mhm.
Because in this early history of this not no, this part of Southeast Asian history, early only in colonial in the colonial framework, but certainly very late in terms of the wider framework of the region. Um, there's already been a lot of interlocution going on, between foreigners and natives and whatnot, and among natives themselves as well. So I think that in order to have to think in terms of a counter narrative to colonial history, you have to think of colonial history as a kind of a really large hegemonic thing that you have to fight, that you have to resist. But when we kind of blow it up and think of it more archipelagically, kind of more in a more dispersed with kind of situation, a lot more autonomy, autonomous histories of different places, people relating, places relating to each other one to one. Um, you know, um, it doesn't make sense to really have something that's a counter narrative, because uh, it would always have to come from a particular perspective. So whose perspective are we talking about when we say the counter narrative of Philippine history? The archipelago itself has, I mean, we were not Filipino until much later, much more recently, like the late 1800s. I would be more inclined to call Jose Rizal the first Filipino than someone like Lapulapu, who, if I can just imagine Lapulapu, if he was really this sort of super belligerent, freedom loving guy, in a bahag and the headdress and everything, like looking really hot on the beach and everything, right? But because that's how he's always pictured. He's always
That's
like
right.
really muscly. So sorry, Vince, you kind of, yeah, uh, put me in a different frame of mind. Someone like him would have probably fought, gone on fighting, just like the Moros, the peoples that the Spaniards would call the Moros, would fight for centuries. He would be more against the idea of Filipino than, say, Humabon and the other datus
Right.
that he was, in conflict, in political conflict with.
Mm.
So it's, from whose perspective, and we know that the different parts of the archipelago um, were incorporated very differently at different times, to different intensities, different degrees, by different people throughout this. Just even talking about the Spanish period, and the geobody was not realized fully, the Philippine geobody, not until the American colonial period. That's what Donna Amoroso and Jojo Abinales point out in their state and society in the Philippines. So, from whose perspective would we have the counter narrative? From the Lumad perspective, it would look very, very different from the perspective of the Tagalogs and the people from Pampanga, for example. So yeah, I mean, we can't really honestly have a counter narrative.
Mhm.
So idea of colonial and then counter-colonial is, to me, not really productive, unless we keep going, and unless we want to be determined continuing a kind of a resistance frame, and we'll just always be resisting, we'll always be resisting.
Right.
And I think that that's not where we really need to be
Mhm.
now. Who are we fighting? I mean, in effect, we're really, a lot of times, I think, really fighting ourselves.
Mm.
And I think that internal conflict is maybe embody all the negative things that are embodied in someone like Duterte.
Mm.
You know.
Great transition to Vince. But before we get to Vince, Una, I thank you for that answer. I'd be curious to hear what you think about Luis Francio's play, Black Henry, because it focuses specifically on Enrique as a central character.
Oh,
And so I'd be
I
happy to
haven't
chat
seen
with
it.
you about it. Yeah. So let's chat about that
Sure,
once
sure. I haven't
once we
seen
get
it.
you. Yeah. So Vince, since you've been invoked,
Yeah.
you've got to tell us, how can we think about Dutertismo, or even him, the figure, as a
Yeah.
kind of pericolonial figure?
Yeah.
What does this mean? Is this part of a Philippine tradition? Is this a Southeast Asian tradition? Is it something what's the proper frame that we can think about in terms of the material you presented us?
Yeah, I very much like the answer of Una and Jody about the difficulty of trying to launch a counter narrative. Nick Wakin, who Jody mentioned, I can't remember now where he had this piece, but he often talked about Humabon, the other, Datu, and Lapulapu as twins, right? He often talked about them as twins. Like, what would have happened if Magellan first landed in Mactan instead of in Cebu? What would have happened if he had made friends with Lapulapu and Lapulapu said, I want you to go over there and kick Humabon's ass, right? Which is essentially what Humabon told Magellan to do. And I'm sure he would have, because Magellan, the savvy colonialist conqueror that he was, would have known how to take advantage of native animosities and turn it to his advantage. So there is a sort of interesting way in which the question of colonial and anti-colonial is absolutely irrelevant to what went on in Mactan 500 years ago. And this idea of commemoration, which is, the whole conference is built on this idea of commemoration. I mean, commemoration is always about two things. One is memorializing. And with memorialization, you have mobilization, right? The mobilization of memory, the mobilization of people, right? On one hand, and on the other hand, reflection, retrospection, right? People sort of coming to terms with their history, trying to reconstruct what exactly happened and what it says about who they are, what these historical inheritances amount to. And to tell you the truth, in the Philippines, I don't think neither is happening. There is no mobilization. There is no commemoration is really restricted among intellectuals, among eggheads, among historians and anthropologists. There's not even an activist quality, unlike 1992, when you mentioned Hanani K. Trask and the Hawaiian sovereignty movement and the indigenous movements. 1992 is very important for the social movements among indigenous people. I don't think anything of that sort is happening in the Philippines. So by and large, Magellan's 500 years of sort of landing in the Philippines, it doesn't have much of a significance, I think, for overwhelming majority of people. And so the question becomes, why is that? Why is it that Spanish colonialism, the beginnings of Spanish colonialism, is seen as, in some ways, far less important than other things, right? Why is it that people are not excited about that? And again, it may have something to do with what Nick O'Kane was saying, that these are Humabon and Lapulapu were twins, and that their descendants very much live on in the Philippines. And the figure of Duterte is one such example. Duterte has often been compared to a datu and so forth. So the question of, is he post-colonial? Is he colonial? Is he neo-colonial? Is he pericolonial? I mean, these are all categories that we wish we could fix and nail down, but in fact, it's quite difficult, right? So I'll stop there and let somebody else raise the question of, well, what's the whole point?
I'm sorry, I'm going to make a really, really terrible, not safe for work joke, but if you know some Spanish, right, you know what culo means.
Oh, yeah.
It's maybe pericolonial.
Very cool.
Oh, wow.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I
Wow.
said that on live internet, right? Okay.
It's forever now. Una.
I know. Oh well. Oh well.
Well, Vince, to the same end, I hope you get a chance also to see Luis's play, because the machinations between Humabon and Lapulapu kind of are front and center. It's really
Sure.
more about them.
Sure.
In many of the scenes, there's an active dialogue as to, I'm just going to cut the deal. Humabon. I'm just going to cut the deal. We're going to see what this guy wants, and I'll take on Lapulapu, but in the end, we know what's really going to happen here. So maybe is it because Filipinos for such a long time have become really quite savvy about these transactions, that many of them have just resisted so much of these colonial narratives? Some of them have certainly succumbed to it over time and propagated it and enforced it. But isn't it maybe something about the history of that region in which so much has already been transacted across the Indian Ocean through the Sri Visayan Empire. The musics also have a kind of commensurate tonality concerning Kulintang and Gamelan. There's all kinds of forms of communication that are bound up into the lived realities for centuries. That the idea of even trying to fix coloniality into the culture, even though it was devastating, still there still is kind of the lack of its ability to adhere so clearly.
I would add to that, also maybe rethinking the whole idea of time, because we're thinking about a sense of the past that we have now and applying it to that period and applying it to, the early colonial period. But we know that there are many societies, especially like in the Pacific, where and we're linked to the Pacific through our Austronesian heritage, that there's the concept of time is not necessarily this sort of chronological thing. It could be more circular or some other concept of time where we know things happened in the past, but the past is something that is a different shape rather than like a kind of a long road that we look at behind us. It could be something that's sort of actively happening here all the time. And when you talked about Humabon and Lapulapu as twins, I'm thinking that there's also a lot of narratives actually in oral traditions all over the Philippines of not pairs, not twins, but brothers or siblings or some other kind of paired individuals that have to do with explaining why things are the way they are now. And it's as if things happened in a kind of a, it happened in the past, clearly the distant past, but time is a completely different shape than how we understand it as, look in terms of historiography. So that's worth kind of considering too. Of course, how we're going to do it is an open question, but I'm just sort of throwing that in there because I think we should also always consider that the way that Lapulapu and Humabon and their immediate descendants would have thought about the past might have been completely different than how we're thinking about the past now.
I want to add something really quick to the conversation. It kind of goes back to something that Vince was saying about what is the role of if anything of a colonial past and understanding of a colonial past in the present. And I like, to my mind, the only thing that I think of like on an immediate level that became suddenly very kind of urgent was the use of Pedro Murillo Velarde's 1748 map to talk about the contours of the South China Sea, because there's an ongoing dispute going on between various countries about who owns or under what sovereignty is the Spratly Islands and all of the adjacent invented islands that China is currently building in the Philippine and South China Sea. And so, to me, like, I think that there's another factor in the equation that we haven't really talked a whole lot about, which is China and the question of Chinese hegemony in the region and how that either refracts or distorts or bends, what people do or don't take from an understanding of the colonial past in the present, and sort of how that would kind of factor into not just whether people care, whether or not the Spanish colonized the Philippines or the Americans took over the Philippines, but more how they might care or how they might indirectly come into contact with those pasts in confronting this kind of overwhelming investment, as well as increasing immigration from China to the Philippines, to the question of national sovereignty in Philippine waters.
Yeah, is that why you included a Q in your presentation about Limahong and the attack?
Well, that's one of those things that really, like, it always kind of strikes.
It's kind of iconic as a moment, right?
Yeah, like, in a way, it's, I mean, China has always been in the Philippines, and it will always be in the Philippines, and it sometimes the presence is much more indirect and muted But you know, we oftentimes, I think, get lulled into this sort of idea that like, oh yeah, then there are a bunch of Chinese people who came to the Philippines, but then they settled there, they became assimilated. Now it's Philippine history. But you know, for a lot of those people, it's not Philippine history. It's actually a continuity of a larger Chinese history that we don't really have a lot of direct
Grasp of.
access to. And so, and so that, you begin to, this kind of goes back to what, Una was saying, is that when you begin to sort of zoom in, and you see that like empire is never really empire. I mean, it is at the top and the most abstract and general level, but everybody's kind of fighting their own or creating their own histories and writing their own narratives. And the long presence of China and Chinese hegemony, economic and now increasingly political, in the region is not something that's included in any Western histories.
I'll just add a quick anecdote about this. When I was doing some work at the University of the Philippines in their archives there, I was researching a book that I was going to eventually write, and came across the papers of Jorge Bacobo, who was in the administration during the colonial period. And his papers are really fascinating in terms of thinking about the anticipation of what official Philippine statehood would look like. So there's a major debate going on amongst the intellectuals, especially at UP. What are the kind of cultural codes, the anchors that we need to hang on to, that's uniquely us, that's uniquely Filipino, right, in that time of the 20s? Because all of the teenagers in on the campus were in tuxedos and listening to Western ball gowns, and listening to jazz music and doing the tango. And so he'd written this essay about what the Philippines should actually use as a proper cultural anchor. And for him, it was Bushido culture of Japan. Just to put that in your bonnet for a second. We have a question from Fernando Herrera, and this goes to Una, but we could circulate it to everyone on the block here, and we'll have to wrap up pretty soon. But what does it mean? This is from Fernando Herrera. What does it mean to delink coloniality from your narrative, Una?
Can you be more specific?
That's the question that was asked. I guess.
Okay.
I guess perhaps in your current work, when you're thinking about.
Okay. I think I know how to answer that. Well, I think for me, coloniality is something that we are still kind of struggling against in our historiography, in our ethnography, in our identity. And when we talk about decolonizing and decoloniality, a lot of times those efforts really seem to be focused on just resisting coloniality. And at the same time you're doing that, you're just constantly reinforcing the reality of coloniality. And really the goal of decolonization should be to extract ourselves from that framework entirely. And of course, that's easier said than done. And I think it's much easier to do, however, historiographically than in a quotidian way. Like today, like we're still in the Philippines and here as well in the States, terribly steeped in coloniality. Coloniality created our current reality, and so how do we extract ourselves from it? I mean, we do the work in here. And that's really the hardest place to do it. But I think the sort of the first place we can try to do that is in our historiography. And I think that's, well, I attempted to do that in my book. And it's, it was more of an experiment than anything. But that I would say, I would point you to my book, A Mountain of Difference, to see. I don't make royalties off of it, so it's not like me having you buy it is gonna. Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't get anything. Yeah, I mean that's how I would do it. I just sort of did it for this one particular part of the Philippines, one particular part of Southeast Asia. I've tried to make it like it's a place in Southeast Asia rather than a place in the Philippines, because back then Philippines was not really a thing, no matter what the Spaniards claimed. Empire is always a claim. That's what empire is. It's an abstract claim, and the reality on the ground is often quite different. That's why when we start going into these histories of these different places, it seems so kind of revolutionary and decolonial. But that's only because we haven't really looked at the histories from those perspectives. I think there's nothing really new. It's just that we're really just sort of finding the layers that have always been there.
Thank you, Una.
I'll
So
stop.
we're coming up toward the end of the hour, so I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to have a final statement. So, Vince, could you lead us off then with some final thoughts of your own? We'll go to Jody.
Gee, I don't know. So much has been said, and but just to hook up to Una's notion of coloniality and decoloniality. I know there's an enormous amount of interest right now in questions of decolonization. I would just want to add that it certainly is an imperative task. I just want to add that alongside the task of decolonization, I think we should also think about denationalization. So much of the Philippines is spoken about as in terms of sort of nationalist terms, a nation state.
Yep.
And one of the effects of that discourse, to me, is to sort of keep reproducing what I regard as one of the most misleading terms in Philippine sort of intellectual studies, which is colonial mentality. I'm not sure exactly where that term came from, but I think colonial mentality does a lot of damage because, among other things, it erases a lot of agency on the part of people who they have had different ways of dealing with the question of coloniality and their own ways of decolonization. So if we could do that, if we could think about decolonization and denationalization, and finally doing something about dismantling this notion of colonial mentality, I think would be much better off.
Jody, a final thought.
Well, maybe in lieu of a final thought,
Okay.
I've been teaching, these concepts of coloniality in a course that I'm teaching this quarter. And, I think it's interesting that, one of the sort of first people to kind of talk about this idea was this Peruvian intellectual, Aníbal Quijano, who talked about coloniality as basically a twin and entwined process to that of the history of capitalism. And the way that he describes it is that it's the inscription of forced labor into a history of capitalism that is based upon this premise of free labor. And kind of extrapolating a little bit more broadly, I think that one of the ways in which we can think of empire is as like an attempted institution of a regime of labor. And to think about that in relationship to the Philippines, the relationship to the Americas, in relationship to Africa and other parts of Asia, in which Indians don't start out Indians, they become Indians through a regime of forced labor. Blacks don't start out blacks, they become blacks through a regime of forced labor. And it's the forced labor that makes the unforced labor of the proletariat possible. And that's Quijano's perspective. And I think that, to extrapolate from that, to think about empire as this very uneven attempt to institute a regime of labor, which leads to two questions. First of all, in what ways do those legacies of coloniality, racism, sexual division of labor, these other kind of concepts that we grapple with in the present, to what degree are they inextricably entwined with the regime of historical capitalism as it's come down to us? That's one question. And then in the second question is in the absence or in the case of capitalism's many failures to implement itself or institute itself according to the so-called principles or laws that it is guided by, what happens? Like what happens in the failure of empire, which is just as common, just as everyday as the successes that we may read about in the history books.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jody.
Is there still time?
Mm-hmm.
1 minute. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, all I would say is that I understand, I realize and appreciate that conferences like this and panels like this, the underlying concern has to do with a quest to understand and maybe unpack and maybe recreate and our own identities as Filipinos. whether in at home or in the diaspora. And the way we think about the past, the way we think about our past and our colonial experience, or whatever, that's really a lot where a lot of it is coming from, and how to think of how to even understand what a Filipino is and how we became Filipinos and what we're supposed to become later. And so all of that is kind of, I know, really wrapped up in one big sort of emotional bundle. And for people listening, I would just say that in terms of my own sort of evolution with that question, I've started to think that, going to Vince's statement about colonial mentality, yes, definitely we have to dismantle that. But at the same time, national history is, to me, also colonial mentality and colonial history. But I wouldn't say let's reject that entirely and kind of resist that and go counter to it. Instead, I would say the way forward is through. The way to the other end is through, and we should embrace who we are as products of this colonial experience. It's not something that's destroyed us or de-indigenized us. Instead, it's made us who we are, and it's that passage that has kind of it's that passage through which our identity has been forged, and it's not something we should sort of reject as something that destroyed some kind of essential Filipino self that we would have somehow achieved if not for the colonial experience. I think it's actually the opposite. And that's why I mentioned Hawkins's quote about let's not think of our history as disrupted. That's not really what happened, Anyway, so I'll end there. But there's, of course, this very long, lifelong conversation about that whole question of identity.
And the lifelong conversation continues. Thank you, Una Paredes. Thank you, Jody Blanco. And thank you, Vicente Rafael, for this panel. I have a couple of announcements before we close tonight. First, this keynote panel concludes the first day of a very special conference, which commemorates the 500th anniversary of the Battle of Mactan. This conference is sponsored by the NYU Global Philippine Studies Forum, the Bulosan Center for Filipino Studies, and Alon, a journal for Filipino American and diasporic studies. Please look to the chat for more information, and please join us for the second day of the Mactan 500 virtual conference, which is taking place tomorrow, Saturday, April 24. Second, please tune into the online production of a full-length play titled Black Henry. That takes place on Sunday, April 25th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It features a talkback following the play with its author, Luis Francia, stage director Claro de los Reyes, and the brilliant professor Nerissa Balse of Stony Brook University. If you miss it on Sunday, do not fear. You can catch additional live broadcasts on Monday and Tuesday at 6:30 Eastern on the KJCC Facebook page. The link will be in the chat. Thank you and good night.